good to see you here today. Welcome back to winter in Florida. But it's invigorating. Wakes you up, gets you going. It's good to have you here. If you're here for the first time or you've just rejoined us, you haven't been here the last couple weeks, just quickly want to recap kind of where we're headed, what we're doing, a challenge I want to give you. As we have looked at this new year, we want to look at and see what the story of the Bible is. Basically, each month we're going to take a different book of the Bible, and there's going to be 12 chapters or 12 months. There's going to be 12 different books we're going to look at, and we're going to look at and see what God's message is to us. We've challenged you to read along with that program, and as you'll see on the back of the bulletin, on the bottom there's a reading schedule. And if you've not been keeping up with that, you can get in on that. You can look at that, take that bulletin each week with you, or you can check out the Anchor app. There's a section there under the study button, or on our webpage. There's also someone created a Facebook connection so that you can get on there and make comments. It's called Dozen Den. In other words, 12 months together study of God's Word. So it is a time that we want to focus on this theme of true north, of seeking and following God. Knowing and following God. That's key. If we are to end up in the destination that God wants us to end up in, that being heaven, we need to stay on course. And the best way to do that is to stay in His Word. So that's the plan, that's the program, that's where we're headed. And today we are going to talk about a guy found in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. His name starts out as Abram. Maybe you've heard him referred to as Abraham. Along the way in his life, he had a name change to Abraham. But it started out as Abram, because Abram lived in an area called Ur of Chaldees. The Ur of Chaldees is what we now know as Iraq. What you'll see there is Iraq is normally, not normally, it still is. It hasn't moved, all right? It's over in this area. And this is what is normally referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Abraham grew up in that area, the Ur of the Chaldees. It was really the cradle of civilization, they called it. Because the Sumerians, the people there, had created quite a sophisticated culture. They came up with an elaborate writing system. They formed large libraries. They had a city school system. They developed the way of numbering by 60s, in which we still use that today to do what? Tell time, 60 minutes on a clock. That's based on the Samaritans' culture. There was a system of weights and measures that was developed. So Abram grew up in this area, the Ur of Chaldees, but somewhere in his childhood, we don't know when, it may have been when he was a young man, his dad moved him and the family up there to Haran, at the northern part of the Fertile Crescent. Haran was also a large area. It was well developed. It was a kind of a trade route intersection where they had all kinds of things coming in across the world from Egypt over to the east and vice versa. So Abram grew up in a sophisticated culture, probably a well-educated man. But something that is interesting, his name, they believe, means the Father is exalted. But that is most likely a reference to a false god worshipped by his family, because the people in Mesopotamia would have worshipped a variety of mythical gods. The chief god being the god of the moon, known as Sin. And that name Abram, they think, points back to that, the Lord of heaven, they would have referred to him as. But not Lord as we think of him, but as Lord as they thought of him. He worshipped false idols and accepted mythology as truth. Now maybe you're surprised to hear that about Abram or Abraham. And quite frankly, I was too when because I kind of always pictured Abraham growing up as that good little Jewish boy that knew everything, all right? And that's why God picked him, right? Because he was able to quote everything. Well, where does this all come on from that he was part of this pagan culture? Well, in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, we find this. Joshua, as he is beginning to address the people for a last time, he's going to challenge them to worship the Lord, not all the false idols of the land. He says to them at the beginning of the chapter, "This is what the Lord God of Israel says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. There it is. Terah, the father of Abraham, and his son Nahor lived on the other side of the river where they worshipped false gods. So why then does Abraham come on the scene? Why is he selected by God in Genesis chapter 12 to do something special? We don't have a specific reason for that, other than to know that God in His infinite wisdom and mercy saw something in this man's heart that He liked. And He did something. He called him out and said, Abram, I've got something special for you. In fact, He called him to leave Haran and move down, follow that red line down to the land of Palestine. It was not a step up in culture. It was not a step up in societal standing. In fact, it was a couple steps down. It was a 900-mile journey. How would you like to walk 900 miles? I don't think so. That's about from here to somewhere in Tennessee. That's how far it would be. It was quite a journey. But God calls him on the journey, and it all begins in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. Here's what God says to Abram. The Lord had said to Abraham, leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to a land which I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses I will curse, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left, as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Now, it was at this time, Abram was 75 years old. Think about that. How many of you are 75 years old or somewhere in the vicinity, if you don't want to raise your hand? Can you imagine packing up everything and going on a 900-mile journey on maybe a camel if you're lucky, or maybe you got to walk a lot of that distance? And he took with him Sarai, his wife, and his nephew Lot, because Lot's dad, Nahor, had passed away. And he took all his belongings and everything, and he left. Why did he leave? Because God commanded him. The verb form used there in the Hebrew where it says, leave your country, leave your land, was in the form of a command. And for some reason, Abram obeyed the command of God, this new entity in his life who really got his attention, and he took off towards a new land. Now hang on to that. We're going to come back to that, but just a bit of a teaching moment here on this passage. This is Introduction to the Bible 101, freshman level college, all right? Because as we look at this year, we're going to be looking at the story of the Bible and how it all comes together. This passage, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, is seen as basically the outline of the rest of the Bible. And here's how. It comes through the three promises made to Abraham. God promised him, go to a land which I will show you, and He will give that land to him and his descendants. All right? So the first 7 chapters of the Bible basically tell that story of how the children of Israel go into that land, and the first 7 books of the Bible tell that story, and that's part of that first promise. You'll get a land. The second part of that promise is, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. Now, the challenge that comes in on that promise at that point in Abram's life is, how many kids did he have? Zilch. At 75. What do you think Abram was thinking? Oh yeah, that sounds good, but we won't worry about that. Just go on. Promised him to make him a great nation. You see the rest of the Bible, basically from the 8th book on, as the story of the development of that nation and the prophets back to those nations once they were established and all that. Then the third promise is key to our understanding of the story of the Bible. It's that, Abram, from you a blessing will come forth that will bless the entire world. Guess what that is? That's Jesus. That's the New Testament, the rest of the story in the New Testament. So this is known as the Abrahamic covenant. It outlines the story of the Bible through the promise of God that there will be a nation, that there will be a land that is given, that there will be a blessing that comes from it, and a nation that is developed. And that's where we find the story of Abraham. And if you go through your reading, you'll see the rest of that story. And Abram had his name changed to Abraham because it came to a point when he was about to have that baby, not when he was 76, not when he was 77, but when he was 99. It actually happened at 100 years old. Then his name was changed and said, Abraham, now you will exalt the Jehovah God. Well, let's get back to that call. He tells him to pack up and move. Abraham's response is interesting. He doesn't do what a lot of us would do. You want me to do what? Look, I'm no spring chicken. You want me to pack all this stuff up and move? You've got to be kidding me. He didn't do any of that. He just did it. But can you imagine the conversations he had with his neighbors, his friends? Hey, Abram, what you doing? Well, we're packing up. We're leaving town. We're moving. Oh, yeah? Where are you going? Back to Ur Chaldees? No, we're going to go somewhere else. Well, where are you going? Well, I don't know yet. We're just packing up. We're going to take off. What do you mean you don't know where? Well, God told us to go somewhere, and we're just going to go. Say what? Well, I received a little bit of ostracization from that, and got some strange looks, and yet he just went on and did it anyway. The entire journey was one that was full of ups and downs and hills and valleys and curves along the way. But there was something about that man that made a difference. So what does all that have to do with us? You're probably thinking, well, God's never come to me in a dream and asked me to do something like that. God's never called me or told me I'm going to be the father of a nation or something like that. So what does that have to do with us? Well, it has to do with the fact that Abraham became known for something, and it's called faith. And faith is one of those things that it's there, yet it's intangible. We think of a magnet or a compass. And that compass, that little needle's magnetized, and you put it down on the table and let it sit there. Where's that needle going to point? It's going to point north. Well, how does that work? It's just a little piece of metal. Well, there's the magnetic fields, and because that thing is all the electrons have been lined up to go a certain direction, they line up with that electronic field or that magnetic field in the earth, and somehow it points north. I can't pick that up and I can't pick up magnetic force and examine it, you know. I can't break it down. I can't say, oh yeah, look here, this is what causes the magnet to do that. It just happens, and I see the results of that in that the needle points north. I got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking about faith. In some ways, faith is the same. It's an intangible. You can't hold up faith and say, yep, here's my faith. You can't dissect it and break it apart and analyze it. You know it when you see it work in someone's life. I want us to think about faith today. Hebrews chapter 11, we have what is known as the Hall of Fame chapter or the faith chapter. And here's how it begins. Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. It's what the ancients were commended for. That phrase, being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see, is an interesting phrase. How do you wrap your head around that? How can you hope for something that you don't know about, and how can you be certain about something you don't see, especially in this day and age where everything has to be empirical data? You've got to be able to pick it up. You've got to be able to analyze it in order to declare that it's real. Yet the writer of Hebrews says, now this is what faith is. It's being sure of what you hope for, certain about what you don't see. I ran across a story that helped me kind of grasp that. It had to do with Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist in Vienna at the beginning of World War II. He was rounded up like so many others were, and he was put in a Jewish concentration camp. Being a psychiatrist, he liked to kind of analyze things, and he was a survivor of all of that. He got out when it was all over and began speaking and writing books. And this is what he says in one of his books about his experience there and why he got out. There's only one reason, he said in his speech, why I am here today. What kept me alive was you, speaking to the audience. Others gave up hope. I dreamed that someday I would be here telling you how I, Viktor Frankl, had survived the Nazi concentration camps. I've never been here before. I've never seen any of you before. I've never given this speech before, but in my dreams, I have stood before you and said these words 1,000 times. He hoped for what he could not see, and he was certain for that hope. Kind of wrap your head around that and think about faith. Viktor Frankl goes on to write in one of his books that he noticed that when people lost hope, they usually died. He said he saw a prisoner as a prisoner that would concentrate their hope on a certain date or a certain event. They said, surely by this Christmas we'll be out, I'll be home, I'll be back with my family. And Christmas would come and go and nothing would change. And he would see hope die in the hearts of those people. And he said it was not long after that most of them died. Because they lost hope. They lost what they placed their faith in. Faith is one of those intangibles, but it's very powerful. Over the years of ministry, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different people. I remember a conversation I had with one man who was a World War II veteran, and he talked about how his faith in God kept him strong through all of that. He was an aerial photographer. He would fly in missions in the South Pacific. They would fly over the enemy territory, and he would take pictures of the positions of the enemy, and then they would take that and report that back so that the U.S. would have a better idea of what was going on the ground. 52 missions he flew, and God watched over him, and he had faith in his God because of that. Talked to a new father in the hospital who just experienced the birth of the first child, and he got to hold that newborn baby. And he remarked how the miracle of the newborn was a testimony to God, and that if anyone had ever doubted God, they had never experienced what he had just experienced, seeing life being born. I've spoken with people who were near death, and they knew it. And rather than talk about how miserable they were and all the pain they were experiencing and all that stuff, instead they talked about the faithfulness of God and how He had never failed them over the years, and how they were waiting and longing for the day when they could be with Him. Faith. All three are different, totally circumstances, and yet they all point to the same thing. Evidence of things not seen, and a hope, and that's which they were sure about. Faith. What does it mean? How do we know it's real? Well, the writer of Hebrews, after he makes that statement about faith, down in in verse 8, says this. And guess who he's going to pick to talk about? He said it was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and to go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going, and even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner, living in tents, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confident. He was confidently looking forward to a city of eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. But what about you and I? When was the last time God tapped you on the shoulder and said, all right, it's time to leave town? Time to get up. It's time to go. Just because we haven't experienced the exact same things that Abraham did does not mean that faith is not something for us or something that's not real. I want to share with you from the life of Abraham and actually is seen through the eyes of the New Testament writers what it is that works. How do we know faith is real? How do we know that it works? Well, there's three things. One, faith that works is seen in obedience. The writer of Hebrews says there, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. The key word there is obeyed. Time and time again, God urges, pleads with His people, obey, obey, obey. How many of you have been parents or are parents have ever found yourself saying or thinking, why didn't you just do what I asked you to do when it comes to your kids? Why didn't you just obey? You wouldn't be in this mess if you just simply obeyed. And I wonder how many times God looks down from heaven and looks at me and looks at you and says, why didn't you just obey? You wouldn't be in this mess. See, faith is obeying God in the little things as well as the big things. It's not left just for the big things of life. It is also sometimes the little things of life. You've probably maybe heard of the story of Eric Liddell. Maybe I'll remind you of it. Eric Liddell, there was a movie made about his life several years ago called Chariots of Fire. You may not know the rest of the story of Eric Liddell. He's known best for the Olympics, but he was born to missionary parents in China. And he grew up in China, worked with his parents, but when he became college age, they moved back to Scotland. And to make a long story short, he went to college, became a very good athlete in track, and in the 1924 Olympics in Paris, he was slated on the Olympic team to run the 100 and the 200-meter dash. Yet he came into conflict with something because the 100-meter dash was scheduled to run on Sunday. And he had been brought up to see Sunday as a holy day and that it would be a disgrace to the Lord to do that, and he made the decision not to run the race. He was not real popular for his decision. He took a lot of flack because of his conviction that I'm going to obey God even in the little things, running a race. They entered him in the 400-meter dash, which is interesting because he had never run that race before, and yet he won the gold medal in that 400-meter dash. And then he did something that was a little bit even more unusual. After he had won that gold medal, what do most athletes do today when they win a gold medal? They take a tour, they sign a book deal, they endorse a product, they get on TV, they make commercials. Now, I realize that not all of that was available in the 1924, but he became a national hero. And yet he did something very out of character for national heroes. He decided to go back to that same little town in China where he grew up and became a missionary. He began teaching in the Bible college there for about 10 years, was eventually married, had 3 children. Then in 1943, if you remember your World War II history, Japan invades China. And when they invaded China, they went through and they rounded up all the missionaries. Eric Liddell was able to get his wife and his 3 children out of the country, and they went away. He stayed there, became a prisoner of war, and yet he ministered to the other missionaries and other people in the prison. He ministered until an undetected brain tumor took his life in February of 1945. But he's the type of the man that the Apostle John had in mind when he says in chapter 2, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." His faith was made known in the little things. as well as the big things. You see, that's faith that works. It's seen in obedience to God. Second thing we can learn from Abraham is that faith that works believes in the promises of God. Paul, another New Testament writer in the book of Romans, says this in chapter 4, verses 19 and following, without weakening in his faith, guess who's going to talk about? Abraham. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old and that Sarah's womb was also dead. There they are, back to that promise, going to make you a nation. Well, God, that's great, but I haven't had any kids yet, and I'm not getting any younger. And when he's 99, God comes to him and said, well, about this time next year, you're going to have a kid. Sarah's in the tent. What does she do? Yeah, that's a good one, God. Well, you got another one today? And yet, God still blessed him with Isaac. Verse 20, yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. How is it that we so quickly sometimes forget the promises of God? I don't know, we just get busy. Life crowds God out sometimes. Something goes wrong, we figure out how are we going to take care of it, what are we going to do, how are we going to survive. But Paul says of Abraham, yet he did not waver. God had told him way back in Genesis 12, says, Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you enough descendants, you won't be able to count them. Like the stars of the sky, the sands of the seashore. Go out to the beach this week and try to count how many sand granules are out there. It says you can't be numbered. It says, I will bless you, and through you there will be a blessing come. Well, I looked up this phrase, I will, to see what other things God said he will do. And you know what? It's interesting. This is just a short list. Listen to some of the promises of God. I will not fail you, Joshua 1:5. I will guide you, instruct you, and teach you, Psalm 32. I will deliver you, Psalm 50. I will help you and strengthen you and uphold you, Isaiah 41. I will comfort you, Isaiah 66. I will forgive, Jeremiah 31. I will restore, Jeremiah 30. I will save you, Ezekiel 36. I will come again, John 14. I will give you a crown of life, Revelation 2:10. You see, the promises of God are true. And if we can be unwavering in believing the promises of God, that's when faith begins to work. One final thing. Faith that works is demonstrated in action. Book of James, chapter 2, verse 21. Guess who's he going to talk about? If you had to guess. Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? What's that all about? Come back next week. We're going to visit it. You'll find out. Verse 22, you see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And James is a great little letter that says faith, you can't have faith over here and put it on the shelf, and you can't have works over here and put them on the shelf. He said, you want me to see your faith? Then show me your works, and through your works I will show you faith. They go hand in glove. Because he knew that faith that works demonstrates itself in action. And he says Abraham did that. And he challenges you and I to do that. Paul Harvey said it right when he said, if you don't live it, you don't believe it. Francis Bacon, another Christian philosopher, said this, it is not what men eat, but what they digest that makes them strong. Not what we gain, but what we save that makes us rich. Not what we read, but what we remember that makes us learned. Not what we preach or pray, but what we practice and believe that makes us Christian. A lot of truth, a lot of wisdom in that phrase. It's not what you eat, it's what you digest that makes you strong. If you were to go on a ice cream and celery diet for 3 months, that's all you ate, ice cream and celery, you probably wouldn't be very healthy at the end of that. Now, I had some people say, I don't know about that ice cream thing. I better check that out. But I don't think so, because if you have nothing to digest, you're not going to be healthy. What are you digesting in your spiritual walk with God? What are you taking in that will make a difference? You see, faith that works leads to actions. It's not what we preach or pray, but it's what we practice and believe that makes us Christians. And it all began with Abraham with this call. Hey, Abram, it's time to get out of town. He said, okay, but where am I going? I don't know. You just follow me and trust me. And you'll end up where you need to be. And he did. Where are you at on that journey? What has God put on your heart? What is He nudging you to do? Where's your faith? Is it based in obedience and the promises of God? Is it going to lead to action of walking true north? My prayer it is for me and for you that we can claim the promise made in Revelation 2:10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let's pray. Lord, we come today and we seek your guidance and we seek your blessing. Lord, in this walk of faith, there's times that we stumble and fall, need to be picked up. We pray, Lord, that you'll be there to do that. Help us, Lord, to live our faith in such a way that others may see you through it. We thank you, we love you, and we need you. It's in Jesus' name we pray.